Presbyterians had a somewhat unique angle on this matter of revival. They were both sympathetic to it in the sense that they really wanted vital religion, but there were voices in the church that were also concerned as to how much change should they make, how much accommodation should they make to the new spirit. And as the 19th century began to develop, the question that began to bubble up is, how important are the unique Reformed doctrines in our confession in this 19th century American world where a great emphasis is on evangelism and revival and renewal and vital religion and bringing people into the church? And what soon developed in the Presbyterian Church was a tension between two groups. The one group said, we really want revival, but we don't think we have to change our old beliefs and practices to have revival. We can remain strong Presbyterians and have revival at the same time. And there was another group that said, now wait a minute, we want to cooperate as much as we possibly can with non-Presbyterian groups. We want to see a united front to promote revival and evangelism and church planting in America. And let's just downplay those Presbyterian distinctives that tend to separate us from other groups. And those two positions gradually got a label by the 1820s. The one group was known as the Old School, and the other group was known as the, yes, you guessed it, New School. Now this gets slightly confusing because in the 18th century, there had been a split in the Presbyterian Church over the Great Awakening, and those splitting groups were known as the Old Side and the New Side. The old side was anti-revival, the new side was pro-revival. But don't get confused about that 18th century split. Now we're talking about the 19th century, the Old School and the New School, both sides pro-revival, but with different attitudes as to what should be distinctively Presbyterian in their support of the revival. And they would debate things like this. How much should there be distinctly Presbyterian organizations for theological education, for home missions, for foreign missions? And how much should we have joint efforts for theological education with the Baptists and the Methodists? Joint efforts on evangelism at home and foreign missions abroad. The New School said we ought to be as cooperative as possible, and we don't need all these distinctly Presbyterian organizations. And the Old School said, well, yes, we can cooperate in various areas, but we really need our own distinctive agencies, organizations, and schools to promote our distinctive point of view. Now, one of the things that really complicated the life of the Presbyterian Church was that in 1801, they entered into what was known as the Plan of Union with the Congregationalists in New England. And at the time of the Plan of Union in 1801, the argument was made, well, look, the only thing that really causes us to differ from the Congregationalists is church government issues. And surely that's a relatively minor concern in light of the vast need of the frontier and the need to carry churches to the West. So why don't we enter into a union with one another, and we'll sort of draw a line heading west, sort of from southern New England, and everything north of that line will be given to the Congregationalists to evangelize, and everything south of that line, sort of from the mid-Atlantic states down, will be given to the Presbyterians to evangelize. So we won't compete with one another, because competing missionaries often confuse the people that are being approached. And then when a church is formed, either by the Congregationalists or by the Presbyterians, that church will have the right to decide for itself, wherever it is relative to that line, whether it wants to join the Congregational Association or whether it wants to join the Presbyterian Church. And the ministers can move freely back and forth. Seemed like a very reasonable point of view at the time. One of the negotiators of that agreement was Jonathan Edwards Jr., Jonathan Edwards' son. So it seemed, you know, a kind of continuation of the spirit, the character of the Great Awakening. The problem was, as time went on, that theology was changing faster in the Congregational churches than it was in the Presbyterian churches. Lyman Beecher had started out as a Congregationalist. And at Yale, there was a new theologian, Nathaniel William Taylor, who was introducing a streamlined, revivalist theology that to Presbyterians sounded an awful lot like Arminianism. And so tensions began to grow as these congregational ministers, influenced by this changing theology, could now freely enter the Presbyterian church. They didn't have to be examined under the plan of union. They could just come in. And this began then to cause greater and greater concern on the part of the old school. Are we seeing our theology diluted? What's going to happen to the Presbyterian church? What are the convictions of the Presbyterians that have to be maintained? And the new school said, you people are just undermining evangelism. You people are just opposed to the growth of the church. Now, have you ever heard some of these discussions before? I sort of feel like I've all my life heard these discussions. How important is to be distinctively Reformed? Does that stand over against evangelism? How are we going to work out these issues? Well, it became very contentious in the Presbyterian Church in the later part of the 1820s and on into the 1830s. And you see, this contention was really about revival. What contributes to revival? What will harm revival? What are compromises that we ought to make to ensure we have revival? These were tensions that Presbyterians began to debate. And for quite a while, it looked as if the new school was going to really carry the day. And as the new school had a majority at the General Assembly year after year, guess what happened? The old school got madder and madder. And Princeton Seminary had been founded in 1812, and Princeton Seminary represented really the most scholarly, conservative, Reformed institution in America. It was essentially old school in its commitments, but Princeton didn't want a war in the church. It didn't want a division in the church. And so Princeton tried to be a moderating influence in the old school while still asserting the importance of remaining distinctively Presbyterian. But others in the old school were really getting angry and insistent that something fundamental had to happen, some fundamental change had to occur. And the old school discovered at the General Assembly of 1837 that they were a majority. And unlike conservative majorities at many church assemblies through the years, the old school acted decisively at that assembly. And they ended the Union of 1801. They said, we'll no longer permit congregational ministers freely enter the Presbyterian Church without examination. And they exscinded. Isn't that a great word? They exscinded, they cut out 4 synods of churches that had been founded under the Union of 1801. And they said those 4 synods are no longer part of the Presbyterian Church. And each of those congregations and their ministers can apply to be readmitted to the Presbyterian Church, and we will examine them, and if they are Orthodox, we'll receive them. But what that meant is the heart of the new school in the Presbyterian Church was thrown out. It was probably the most dramatic moment in the history of American Presbyterianism. This really colossal action. Charles Hodge was not at that assembly, and when he received word of what had happened, he was appalled and flabbergasted. He never imagined such a thing might happen. And there it was, this dramatic change overnight to the Presbyterian Church. So what happened? Well, the New School decided that they would appeal this decision to the next General Assembly. That had been going on. There had been a sort of ping-pong ball in the Presbyterian Church back and forth. And they thought, well, you know, if we really get organized, maybe we can retake control of the General Assembly and change that action. So the General Assembly was due to meet in Philadelphia in 16, I'm all right, in what century? In 1838. And they were going to meet at the Seventh Presbyterian Church. Regrettably, the building no longer stands. But Philadelphia was the mother city of American Presbyterianism. It was the Grand Rapids of the Presbyterians compared to the Dutch Reformed. And so there were all these churches. You know, we still have 10th Presbyterian Church. In those days, you didn't name a church after an apostle or something, you just numbered it. And there were many Presbyterian churches in Philadelphia. The General Assembly was going to meet at 7th Presbyterian Church, and the New School said, we're going to get there early, and we're going to sit up front, and we're going to demand the attention of the moderator, and we're going to take control of this assembly and reverse the action. Well, the Old School heard that this was the plan. And the old school conservatives, maybe for the first time in church history, outthought and outacted the liberals, and the Old School got there even earlier and occupied all the front seats. And when the New School arrived, they were forced into the back, and the temporary moderator of the assembly began to call the roll. And he didn't call the roll for the 4 extended synods, even though their representatives were there. And so when the roll call was over, someone from one of the synods raised his hand and said, "Mr. Moderator, you have not called my name." And the moderator said, "What is your name?" He said, "I'm Mr. So-and-so from such and such a place." And the moderator looked at him and said, "Sir, we do not know you," meaning you are not part of this assembly. And with that, the New School representatives stood up and organized themselves in the aisle of the church into a general assembly of their own, and they marched out of church down the street to First Presbyterian Church and began the meeting of the New School General Assembly, insisting that they were the real Presbyterian Church. And so from 1838 down till 1869, there were 2 Presbyterian churches in America with the same name. That's an honored Reformed tradition, take the same name, so historians are left in utter perplexity as to how to designate groups. We had 2 Presbyterian churches. The New School, interestingly enough, was the smaller of the 2 groups. The Old School Presbyterian Church was the larger group, and the New School was smaller and, intriguingly, grew more slowly in the decades after the split. The Old School grew more quickly, and that seems sometimes kind of counterintuitive, but the Old School had really strong leadership. They had Princeton Seminary as well as other seminaries, and the Old School of the Presbyterian Church did well. They were not anti-revival. They were pro-revival. But they were pro-revival in a way that thought the essentials of Presbyterianism should not be compromised. And the creation of the Old School didn't solve every problem. There were still tensions. There were tensions over slavery, for example. Slavery, of course, was becoming, in the 1830s, the 1840s, the 1850s, an ever more divisive issue in America. In the South, the dominant position was that slavery had to be maintained, and in the North, increasingly, there was sentiment that slavery ought to be ended. Some in the North were abolitionists, which said slavery has to be ended right now, and others said, well, we have to find a gradual way to end slavery. But this became a very divisive issue, but it is intriguing that issue was somewhat divisive in the Presbyterian Church as well. And the Presbyterians in 1818 had addressed that issue and had developed a statement on that issue. Now, this is the Presbyterian General Assembly in 1818 adopted this statement. We consider the voluntary enslaving of one part of the human race by another as a gross violation of the most precious and sacred rights of human nature, as utterly inconsistent with the law of God. It is the duty of all Christians to efface this blot on our holy religion and obtain the complete abolition of slavery throughout Christendom and, if possible, throughout the world. That's a very strong statement. Now, it's using the word abolition before abolition became a kind of technical term for immediate end of slavery. But notice what it said. This is a gross violation of the rights of human nature, utterly inconsistent with the law of God. The duty of all Christians to blot out, to efface this blot on our religion. That's a very strong statement, and it wasn't very controversial in 1818. It wasn't very controversial with Southern Presbyterians any more than with Northern Presbyterians. But what had happened since 1818 is that the institution of slavery had been growing in the South because of the invention of the cotton gin, which made the production of cotton much more efficient, much more effective, and required, in the end, more slaves to produce the cotton. So the South, after 1818, saw more slaves, became more financially dependent on slavery. And the Presbyterian Church dealt with this developing situation in the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s by having the General Assembly say nothing. No General Assembly said anything about slavery from that 1818 statement to the outbreak of the Civil War. But I think it's important that we note that this statement was never revoked. This was the statement of the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church. But the nation was headed to war. And that war was going to have an impact on the Presbyterian Church. And that impact on the Presbyterians is exactly the impact that it would have on almost every American denomination. Namely, that the division of the nation would lead to the division of the churches. The Methodist Church had broken earlier into Northern and Southern Methodist churches. The Baptists would divide into Northern Baptist churches and Southern Baptist churches. And the Presbyterians, too, much later than other denominations, would finally split in 1861 into the Northern Presbyterian churches and the Southern Presbyterian churches. But we'll have to return to that story when we continue to look at the Presbyterians in our next lecture. Thank you.
Yeah, I never really appreciated the term Southern Baptist, Southern Methodist. Never really connected that to the slavery debate. was the difference between the Presbyterians and the other denominations? Especially the old school Presbyterians.
Cautious.
What?
Cautious.
Cautious, right. They didn't want to desert their distinctives, so they weren't as willing to give up on elements of their theology and the way their denomination was defined. They didn't want to give those things away, so yeah, they were cautious. So I found an article on the internet called Princeton and Slavery. So remember, Princeton started out as the College of New Jersey and then formed as a university and a theological seminary. And this whole buildup is going through all this time where the country is dealing with the operations of slavery, and it has a tremendous impact on just about everything. Presbyterianism became a national denomination in the 18th century, so in the 1700s, and there were a lot of viewpoints on slavery, and you had major leaders in the church. They owned slaves. Other major leaders were kind of moderate anti-slavery advocates, and then you had abolitionists too. So you find that these different outlooks were in the same church. Now remember, he said it was the Scotch-Irish that comprised the large part of American Presbyterians. They kind of focused on the middle colonies, and they lived among slaveholders, and some of them owned slaves. And there was a reverend at the time named Francis McKemey, and he's often regarded as the father of American Presbyterianism. And he helped form major early congregations. He organized the first presbytery in 1706, and Dr. Godfrey had a different date, but it kind of depends on how you define presbytery. And he made a contribution to the principle of religious toleration, because there was a court case in New York the following year, and so this guy got the Presbyterian Church started, this reverend, and he also owned slaves. The article says he held property in human beings. So he came from Ireland and came to the U.S. He married into a wealthy family that had a lot of land holdings, and you needed labor for your land holdings. And he had a considerable number of slaves. When he wrote up his will in 1708, he had 33 slaves that had to be distributed to his heirs. So we move on to another gentleman named Samuel Davies. He was the president of the College of New Jersey, and he helped extend Presbyterianism into Virginia. He was very interested in ministering to slaves, and he championed literacy for enslaved people. And he was committed to the spiritual welfare of slave people, but he never questioned the legitimacy of slavery. He owned some slaves himself in Virginia, but he did have this heart for their spiritual welfare. Now, the Scots and the Scotch-Irish people had a very large role trading slaves, being managers and owners in the plantation system. You have a couple of U.S. presidents who grew up in Scotch-Irish tradition. You've got Andrew Jackson, James K. Polk, and they pursued policies in the 19th century that expanded southern states weren't. This article makes a reference to the 1818 statement that the Presbyterian General Assembly wrote, and a quote from that says, "We consider the voluntary enslaving of one part of the human race by another as a gross violation of the most precious and sacred rights of human nature and utterly inconsistent with the law of God." Godfrey quoted that too. So that assembly in 1818 called on Christians to get rid of this blot on their religion and obtain complete abolition of slavery. Now, the way abolition was used then, it meant just get rid of it, abolish it. Abolition came to mean immediate, instant, you're a slave yesterday, you're free today. So abolition took on a greater force as we get closer to the Civil War period. So that's why, John Brown, the abolitionist, people were so angry about his position because he wanted slaves to just end like whammo. So this Presbytery statement in 1818, we know that it hung around for a long time. It was interesting, at the same General Assembly, they made the statement against slavery, but then they defrocked a minister in Virginia. His name was George Bourne, Reverend George Bourne. They defrocked him because he condemned slaveholders as sinners. So you've got this schizophrenic, behavior even in that General Assembly. We defrock this guy, and then we write this anti-slavery statement. So you've got an interesting outlook towards slaves, and there was more of a moderate approach, and there was also the effort to colonize Africa and take people of color and return them to Africa. You guys have heard of that before, that we were going to repopulate some parts of Africa. It wasn't very much of a successful effort. I don't think anybody really got on board with it too much, but it seemed to be something that generated a lot of interest and talking. But here's a statement that historian Andrew Murray made. He said, "Colonization was all things to all men. To the slaveholder, it offered a means of satisfying an uneasy conscience by transporting his emancipated slaves to Africa, where they would not become public charges. To the moderate anti-slavery advocate, it held out the hope of the eventual elimination of slavery without antagonizing the slaveholder." So it was kind of one of those things that, well, this will make everybody feel better, and we'll get rid of the blot of slavery. Now, abolitionism began to rise up, the immediate emancipation, and that was also perceived as a threat introduction